Topic 6.7, Labor in the Gilded Age Learning Objective. Explain the socio-economic continuities and changes associated with the growth of industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898. The expression Gilded Age, first used by Mark Twain in 1873 as the title of a book, referred to the superficial glitter of the new wealth so prominently displayed in the late 19th century. The characterization of the period from 1865 to 1898 as the Gilded Age has proved a useful label for an era in which the captains of industry controlled large corporations, created great fortunes, and dominated politics. At the same time, the problems faced by workers, farmers, and burgeoning cities festered under the surface of the new wealth. Challenges for wage earners. The growth of industry was based on hard physical labor in mines and factories. However, for the people doing these jobs, life was hard. Wages. By 1900, 2/3 of all employed Americans worked for wages, usually at jobs that required them to labor 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Wages were determined by the laws of supply and demand. Because there was usually a large supply of immigrants competing for factory jobs, wages were barely above the level needed for bare subsistence. Low wages were justified by David Ricardo, 1772 to 1823, whose famous Iron Law of Wages argued that raising wages would only increase the working population, and the availability of more workers would in turn cause wages to fall, thus creating a cycle of misery and starvation. Real wages, income adjusted for inflation or deflation, rose steadily in the late 19th century, but even so, most wage earners could not support a family decently on one income. Therefore, working-class families depended on the income of women and children. In 1870, about 12% of children were employed outside the home. By 1900, that number had increased to about 20%. In 1890, 11 million of the 12.5 million families in the United States averaged less than $380 a year in income. Labor discontent. Before the Industrial Revolution, workers labored in small workplaces that valued an artisan's skills. People often felt a sense of accomplishment in creating a product from start to finish. Factory work was radically different. Industrial workers were often assigned just one step in the manufacturing of a product, performing semi-skilled tasks monotonously. Both immigrants from abroad and migrants from rural America had to learn to work under the tyranny of the clock. In many industries, such as railroads and mining, working conditions were dangerous. Many workers were exposed to chemicals and pollutants that only later were discovered to cause chronic illness and early death. Industrial workers rebelled against intolerable working conditions by missing work or quitting. Yet they changed jobs on the average of every 3 years. About 20% of those who worked in factories eventually dropped out of the industrial workplace rather than continuing. This was a far higher percentage than those who protested by joining labor unions. The struggles of organized labor. The late 19th century witnessed the most deadly and frequent labor conflicts in the nation's history. Many feared the country was heading toward open warfare between capital and labor. Industrial warfare. With a surplus of low-cost labor, management held most of the power in its struggles with organized labor. Strikers could easily be replaced by bringing in strikebreakers, or scabs, unemployed persons desperate for jobs. Employers used several tactics for defeating unions. Lockout, the act of closing a factory to break a labor movement before it could get organized. Blacklist, a roster of the names of pro-union workers that employers circulated so that these people could not find work. Yellow dog contract, a contract that included as a condition of employment that workers could not join a union. Private guards and state militia, forces used by employers to put down strikes. Court injunction, judicial action used by an employer to prevent or end a strike. Moreover, management fostered public fear of unions as anarchistic and un-American. Before 1900, management won most of its battles with organized labor because, if violence developed, employers could almost always count on the support of the federal and state governments. Tactics by labor workers were divided on the best methods for defending themselves against management. Some union leaders advocated political action, others favored direct confrontation, strikes, picketing, boycotts, and slowdowns to achieve union recognition and collective bargaining. the ability of workers to negotiate as a group with an employer over wages and working conditions. Great Railroad Strike of 1877. One of the worst outbreaks of labor violence in the century erupted in 1877. During an economic depression, the railroad companies cut wages in order to reduce costs. A strike on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad quickly spread across 11 states and shut down 2/3 of the country's rail lines. Railroad workers were joined by 500,000 workers from other industries in an escalating strike that quickly became national in scale. For the first time since the 1830s, a president, Rutherford B. Hayes, used federal troops to end a labor dispute. The strike and the violence finally ended, but not before more than 100 people had been killed. After the strike, some employers addressed the workers' grievances by improving wages and working conditions, while others took a harder line by busting workers' organizations. Attempts to organize national unions. Before the 1860s, unions had been organized as local associations in one city or region. They were usually craft unions, ones focused on one type of work. National Labor Union. The first attempt to organize all workers in all states, skilled and unskilled, agricultural and industrial, was the National Labor Union. Founded in 1866, it had some 640,000 members by 1868. Besides championing the goals of higher wages and the 8-hour day, it also had a broad social program: equal rights for women and African Americans, monetary reform, and worker cooperatives. Its chief victory was winning the 8-hour day for federal government workers. It lost support, however, after a depression began in 1873 and after the unsuccessful strikes of 1877. Knights of Labor. A second national labor union, the Knights of Labor, began in 1869 as a secret society in order to avoid detection by employers. Under the leadership of Terence Powderly, the union went public in 1881, opening its membership to all workers, including African Americans and women. Powderly advocated a variety of reforms: 1. Forming worker cooperatives to make each man his own employer; 2. Abolishing child labor; 3. Abolishing trusts and monopolies; and 4. Settling labor disputes by arbitration rather than strikes. Because the Knights were loosely organized, however, Powderly could not control local units that decided to strike. The Knights of Labor grew rapidly, attaining a peak membership of 730,000 workers in 1886. However, it also declined rapidly after the violence of the Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886 turned public opinion against the Union. Haymarket bombing Chicago, with about 80,000 Knights in 1886, was the site of the first May Day labor movement. Also living in Chicago were about 200 anarchists who advocated the violent overthrow of all government. In response to the May Day movement, calling for a general strike to achieve an 8-hour day, labor violence broke out at Chicago's McCormick Harvester plant. On May 4th, workers held a public meeting in Haymarket Square, and as police attempted to break up the meeting, someone threw a bomb, which killed 7 police officers. The bomb thrower was never found. Even so, 8 anarchist leaders were tried for the crime, and 7 were sentenced to death. Horrified by the bomb incident, many Americans concluded that the Union movement was radical and violent. The Knights of Labor, as the most visible union at the time, lost popularity and membership. American Federation of Labor. Unlike the reform-minded Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, concentrated on bread and butter unionism, attaining narrower economic goals. Founded in 1886 as an association of 25 craft unions of skilled workers and led by Samuel Gompers until 1924, the AFL focused on just higher wages and improved working conditions. Gompers directed his local unions to walk out until the employer agreed to negotiate a new contract through collective bargaining. By 1901, the AFL was by far the nation's largest labor organization with 1 million members. Even this union, however, would not achieve major successes until the early decades of the 20th century. Strikes and strike-breaking in the 1890s. 2 massive strikes in the last decade of the 19th century demonstrated both the growing discontent of labor and the continued power of management to prevail in industrial disputes. Homestead strike. Henry Clay Frick, the manager of Andrew Carnegie's Homestead steel plant near Pittsburgh, precipitated a strike in 1892 by cutting wages by nearly 20%. Frick used the weapons of the lockout, private guards, and strikebreakers to defeat the steelworkers' walkout after 5 months. 16 people, mostly steelworkers, died in the conflict. The failure of the Homestead strike set back the union movement in the steel industry until the New Deal in the 1930s. Pullman strike. Even more alarming to conservatives was a strike started by workers living in George Pullman's company town near Chicago. The Pullman Palace Car Company manufactured widely used railroad sleeping cars. In 1894, Pullman announced a general cut in wages and fired the leaders of the workers' delegation who came to bargain with him. The workers at Pullman laid down their tools and appealed for help from the American Railroad Union. The ARU's leader, Eugene Verrer of Debs, directed railroad workers not to handle any trains with Pullman cars. The union's boycott tied up rail transportation across the country. Railroad owners supported Pullman by linking Pullman cars to mail trains. They then appealed to President Grover Cleveland, persuading him to use the Army to keep the mail trains running. A federal court issued an injunction forbidding interference with the operation of the mail and ordering railroad workers to abandon the boycott and the strike. For failing to respond to this injunction, Debs and other union leaders were arrested and jailed. The jailing of Debs and others effectively ended the strike. In the case of In re Debs, 1895, the Supreme Court approved the use of court injunctions against strikes, which gave employers a very powerful legal weapon to break unions. After serving a 6-month jail sentence, Debs concluded that more radical solutions were needed to cure labor's problems. He turned to socialism and the American Socialist Party, which he helped to found in 1900. Conditions in 1900. By 1900, only 3% of American workers belonged to unions. Management held the upper hand in labor disputes, with government generally taking its side. However, people were beginning to recognize the need for a better balance between the demands of employers and employees to avoid the numerous strikes and violence that characterized the late 19th century. During the Gilded Age, industrial growth was concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest regions, the parts of the country with the largest populations, the most capital, and the best transportation. As industries grew, these regions developed more cities and attracted more immigrants from overseas and migrants from rural areas.